Well, it's March 2026, and this is episode 302 of Permanently Moved, a personal podcast now produced quarterly, written, recorded, and edited by me, Jay Springett. This episode, Monsters in the Mirror, comes with an accompanying print artifact. Issue 15 of my zine, Start Select Reset. It includes the full essay text plus extra material that isn't in the recording. Details on how to get it are in the show notes and on my blog, thejmo.net. Alright then, let's begin. Monsters in the Mirror. When you look into a mirror, what do you see? What does a mirror reveal about both yourself and the world? Everything that follows depends on one claim. Any kind of mirror, whether epistemic or physical, becomes a habitat at sufficient scale, and habitats always produce their own inhabitants. What changes when you stop looking into a mirror and start looking at it instead? Part 1. The Mirror of Modernity. The primal mirrors of humanity were pools of still water, hominids peering over a pond's edge, seeing their proto-human reflections in them for the first time, their first inkling of a virtual self in a world without true self-image. Campfire stories, still told today from time depths so deep they belong to the mythic realm, warn us that to see one's reflection in still water was unlucky or dangerous, as the water spirits would pull the person in. Later we polished obsidian, then copper, then bronze. Then the Romans laid a thin layer of gold behind glass. They believed that mirrors reflected not just a person's physical likeness, but a fragment of their soul. Because life renewed itself in 7-year cycles, to break a mirror was to damage or trap a piece of the soul, leaving it vulnerable to misfortune until one's body and spirit had been fully renewed. It was a common practice to cover mirrors in a house where someone had died, for fear that the departed soul might become trapped in its reflection, unable to move into the afterlife. Even later, during the dawn of the Renaissance, a new kind of mirror was invented, not of glass, but of geometry. Standing in the doorway of Florence Cathedral around 1420, Filippo Brunelleschi performed an experiment that would change how the European mind would see itself. He painted the view of the baptistry using linear perspective, a mathematical system based on receding lines that met at a single vanishing point. Through a small hole in the painting and a mirror held at arm's length, Brunelleschi asked people to compare his image to the real scene beyond. Finding the work so precise, it was felt that art and reality had perfectly aligned. At that moment, the old mirror world of spirits, doubles and divine reflection collapsed into the physical one. The mirror was no longer a thing that split self and subject, but reflected the visible world alone. The demonstration of perspective suddenly gave people a point of view, and this transformed vision into a science of space, the beginning of the perspectival age that would define Western thinking for centuries to come. Then, during the Enlightenment, glassmakers on the tiny island of Murano perfected a method of coating glass with tin mercury amalgam and created the first mirrors of modernity. It is said that in the late 17th century, the Countess de Fiesque of France once traded an entire wheat farm for a Venetian mirror and considered it a bargain. A life of grain for a life in the face. As the artisans of Venice were perfecting the modern mirror, the concept of science was also coming into view, intertwined technologies of sensing and thought. Building on Christian Huygens' foundational studies of light and reflection, the alchemist Isaac Newton invented the reflecting telescope. Science then began methodically overcoming technical hurdles like surface scattering and optical aberrations, transforming the mirror into a definitive tool of invention. These refinements allowed us to push past previous limits, viewing the visible world with a newfound precision and depth. Today, mirrors are everywhere, in microscopes, spectrometers, and lasers. Mirrors are in antennas and satellites, and in the machines that print our microchips. They are in solar furnaces, fusion experiments, and particle accelerators. The modern mirror provides us with a kind of physics, both literal and figurative, that shapes the world that we experience around us, how we see, and not just what we know, but how we know it. For example, the mirrors of the James Webb Telescope recently reshaped just not what we knew, but what astrophysicists could believe about stars, nebula, and galaxies. When we look at a mirror and not into it, what we see reflected is a worldview, a way of seeing, a way of knowing. To understand the mirror of modernity, in this show I propose a taxonomy of magical mirrored surfaces. We'll arrive at the newest one and its implications in due time, but first we need to understand the technologies through which humanity attempts to see itself whole. Mirrors that reflect, the classical optical surface, the bounce of light that shows us what is. Mirrors that render, the ledger and the printing press, surfaces that translate the world into a legible form, mirrors that rank, statistics and tools that calculate across the things rendered, mirrors that predict, simulation, processes that show us not what is, but what is likely, and mirrors that actuate, the operational mirror, the monster that doesn't just watch the world, but can speak back. Anyone who has sat for a spell in front of a mirror and truly looked at what they see reflected knows that what it shows doesn't show the whole you, an image, but not the life that gazes back. Part 2. The state's gaze. As we stared into and through glass lenses, other sensing services were being polished, the ledger and the survey. These are the mirrors that render, mirrors that were made by humans but found far more useful by para-human entities like the nation-state and capital, new ways of seeing and modes of knowing that reflected a worldview into being and, in doing so, rendered other worlds invisible. During the Renaissance in Italy, capital C capital was arriving at its own perspective on the world through the mirror of double-entry bookkeeping. With its elegant equation of assets equals liabilities plus equity, double-entry bookkeeping created a rational reflection of commerce. Every debt had its credit. The fleshy reality of human exchange flattened into entries in a ledger. Like a drum skin, double-entry bookkeeping captured the chaotic vibrations of commerce and human exchange and translated them into rational signal. These vibrations were only revealed once they were caught in the ledger's mirror. Crucially, this trap gave capital a way to see itself, a mechanism to admire its own expansion and reaffirm its logics: buy, hold, and sell. For humanity to invent such a thing as a ledger of transactions over time in the form of a book was an act of transcendence. It shifted record-keeping away from a reactive diary of the present, a linear list of grain sold or silver spent, into a self-contained mathematical world. Balancing the books conjures a virtual body distinct from the merchant's own flesh, allowing them to see past the physical pile of coin and into the invisible, temporal currents of profit and loss. It created the abstract body of a business. When a business takes action, signs a contract, acquires a competitor, files for bankruptcy, no human made that decision in the way that we understand individual choice. The board might have voted, yes, but they voted according to fiduciary duty, a legal obligation that exists only within the magical mirror of law. The business acts, therefore it is an actor. We have been living with non-human agents for centuries. We simply call them legal persons and pretend the animism away. Once inside this new reality, the business can survive its creators as a persistent boundary-making thing, compelling the behaviour of the people inside it through accounting reality, wages, debt, and compliance. It is in this habitat that capitalism gained access to a new, more favourable medium, a growth factor within which its logics could flourish. James C. Scott's concept of legibility is the other half of this transition. While Scott's foundational story of how states simplify the world has finally gained the cultural traction it deserves, we have already moved into what sociologists Foucault and Healy call the ordinal society. We no longer live in a world that is merely made readable. We live in one that is perpetually ranked, sorted, and scored. The project of ordinalization begins with the sensing device most favoured by the state. If the ledger was a mirror that rendered, statistics becomes the mirror that ranks. To govern is to see. The Latin word sensus literally means to feel or to perceive, and the burgeoning states of Europe were desperate for sensation. The name for this new instrument, the one that made things more legible to the state, emerged in Prussia and tells us everything that we need to know. Statistik, German for the science of the state. Through maps, census and survey, populations and territories were made visible, taxable and conscriptable. Through this process, territory ceased to be a living landscape of custom and kin, but a divisible resource to be managed and controlled. Statistics, unlike the technology of the lens or the mirror, does not reflect what they see the world to be. Instead, it sorts and ranks reality into what can be counted and controlled. As Marek Pollux and Roberto Alonso Trillo argue in Exocapitalism, capitalism is an alien mode of thought that has used the human species as incidental host. The ledger represents the moment it gained access to its favourable medium, the mathematical great outdoors. By translating the world into numbers, the ledger allowed capital to become a self-addressing algorithm. Functionally free to engage its own internal drives, it responds to environmental conditions, like market signals, and it modifies the environment to sustain its own operation. Enclosure, financialization, and rent extraction. These are all behaviours of an agent, whether housed in flesh, silicone, or symbolic abstraction. The ledger and the database render a certain kind of reflection of the world's form into existence, but they were haunted from the very beginning. So with rendering comes ranking, and after that inevitably comes probability, a science that through reason seeks to tame the universe itself and quantify the unknown and what might be. For the ancient Greeks, randomness was divine. A roll of the dice was a way of letting the gods speak and act in the world. Through the use of the sortition machine, the results of democracy were, to the Athenians, divinely mandated. The Enlightenment reduced divine influence to variables to be managed, yet magic is, fundamentally, the art of shifting probabilities. The Age of Reason held up its mirror and declared the universe a closed mechanical system, rational and predictable. But the project failed to exercise its spirits, and even bred fresh ones of its own. It created a mirror that allowed capitalism to watch itself, and over time, so transfixed by what it saw, it effectively lifted away and became them. Today, capital has completely forgone the body of the world, escaping into an unblemished geometry of the markets and computation. Abstracted away to such an extent that to leave a column in a ledger unreconciled is akin to the shattered mirror of Rome, a fracture in the soul of the entity that it conjures. Baudrillard's nightmare was capital's dream. The map covered the territory and seduced it, consumed it, and took its place. Part 3. Paper Truths. Before the mirror of modernity could be built from glass or silicon, the world was caught in a net of words. In the deep time of our species, language wasn't anything like what we imagine it today. Back then, to speak something aloud was to weave the world itself. In Australia's Aboriginal songlines, the ancestors sang the world into existence, naming things to make them real, and when they were done, they settled into what they had made. In the Vedic tradition, Vak is the goddess of both speech and the cosmos' creative force. In ancient Egypt, the concept of Heka treated magic and speech as synonymous, a gift to humanity to continue the creator's works. To pronounce a thing correctly was to draw a thing from potential into form. The book of Genesis does not claim that God built the world, but instead that he spoke it into existence. Let there be light. And St. John, by the way of King James, gave us perhaps the most beautiful tricolon crescendo in the whole of the English language. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Before print, language was an ontological event. Truth happened in the moment, remade every time it was reaffirmed aloud, not something fixed and persistent. As we moved from the oral to the written culture, the magic of language was systematized. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe, brought us the gifts of writing. In doing so, laid a new architecture over the existing cosmic order. In ancient Mesopotamia, the goddess Nisba was associated with not just writing, but also ledgers. She counted both the ears of grain in the field and the stars in the night sky. Writing proliferated, it became an engine of technocratic administration in the universe. But it did not replace the language of creation itself. It extended the short-range power of the voice into fixed forms. Decrees on stele that outlasted breath. Speech travelling without a speaker on a piece of papyrus. Writing was a delegation of will. The magical transmutation of speech into symbol took many forms. The Norse carved runes of the Galdar or incantation. Their acoustics, when read aloud back into the world, could alter fate. The Greek magical papyri are also full of voce magicae, or words of power, that have no semantic meaning but still hold operative force. For 1400 years, the power of the written word was contained by another technology, the codex. By stacking separate leaves of paper and binding them along a single edge with a definitive beginning and end, the book replaced the infinite roll of the scroll. A change in shape and a change in authority, it allowed for indexing and cross-referencing, the pinning of truth to a specific page. In the West, this technology has historically been synonymous with the one and only book that mattered at all. But then, in the mid-15th century, we built a machine that industrialized it all. When Johannes Gutenberg adapted the screw press to movable type, he invented a way of freezing the truth. In the oral world, a word is a sound that happens. In the printed world, it's something that remains. The chaotic generative power of the spoken word and the ritual power of symbols were fed into a press and stamped out to create something new. An artifact that completed the transformation of the word from event into object. The press created the illusion that truth was stable, something that could be captured, set in lead and archived. It created the concept of the edition, the sense that reality could be updated or set to rest in final draft. Marshall McLuhan described print as a technology of individualism, shifting culture from the communal sensory experiences of the tribal age to private, visual, linear thought, fostering a new, private point of view. Despite this individualistic nature, Walter Ong argued that print is also a technology of conformity. To print a book is one thing, the math literacy required to read it is something else. Over time, the messy vernaculars of Europe were pruned into national languages, standardised French, High German, the King's English. The press acted as a filter, stripping away the idiosyncrasies of local orality, creating a surface of text that could be distributed widely across a new legible territory. This was the first mass reflection. When a citizen read the morning paper, they gazed into a paper mirror that reflected not their own individual face, but rendered the face of the nation. As Benedict Anderson observed, this allowed for the formation of imagined communities, a new social ability to feel a deep kinship with millions of people you will never hope to know or ever meet, simply because they were all holding the same page, consuming the same reflection of the world at the same time. By locking the word into a static mass-produced object, the press shattered the unity of Christendom. When truth is oral, it's fluid and negotiated. When it's printed, it is absolute. The wars of religion that tore Europe apart in the 16th and 17th centuries were, in many ways, the violent thrashing of a society caught in a language trap. Once the Bible became a fixed text in newly standardized vernacular, interpretation became the battleground in a culture war. Disagreement was no longer a difference of opinion, but a heresy against an objective reality. A lot of people died for their opinions, or they escaped the bloodshed for the new world. Ever since then, paper has held a certain kind of world together, sustaining the Enlightenment belief in a single objective reality that could be written down and agreed upon. It allowed for the creation of the public sphere, a rational space where the paper mirror's reflection could be debated, but rarely doubted in form. What kept the paper world stable was its friction. The printing press could reproduce a truth, but slowly. Distribution took time. Correction took time. This temporal buffer created a shared epistemic commons, not because everyone agreed, but because everyone was navigating the same lag between event and representation. It was still only a temporary truce, imposed by the physics of ink, paper, and distribution. Part 4. Crystal Fire. For all our parents and grandparents, and depending on your age, perhaps you too, the world was built on paper. Information was tangible, you could fold, stamp, sign and file it. A ration book, a payslip, a letter on headed paper, the world arrived in envelopes and lived in drawers. But beneath all this bureaucracy, a bottleneck was forming. And to understand what broke it open, I want to take a short detour into the details, because the story of the next mirror's arrival isn't ancient history. It happened in the lifetimes of the people who raised you. As early as the 19th century, the scale of society had begun to exceed the speed of paper. The state's gaze was myopic, not because it couldn't render the world in enough detail, but because it was too slow to see very far. In the late 1800s, there was already so much to count that the United States' 1880 census took nearly a decade to tally. The portrait of a nation was only finished just as the next one began. So great was the volume of data that the state was effectively flying blind, seeing a reflection of a society that had already ceased to exist. This bureaucratic stalemate birthed the Tabulating Machine Company in 1896, when Herman Hollerith traded the pen for the punch card. Paper was disciplined into something machinic. Information could be sorted, counted, recounted, and reassembled into new perspectives. So the state's vision was sharpened. Hollerith's tabulating machines gave the ledger a faster refresh rate. For most of human history, calculation was a manual kind of labour, performed by humans to the clattering of abacus beads or as a quiet scribbling in the margins. Logic was heavy, and held the world still long enough to understand it. But the human mind could not act faster than the world it described. But with paper punch cards in hand, we were making progress. All parahuman institutions are hungry. They want to move faster than the world, or at least not slower than it. So, with more immediacy comes a new desire that is as nearly as old as any other myth recounted here. The wish for a mirror that predicts the future. The shift from render to simulation arrived on the back of a gun and the bomb. In the 1940s, the speed of war had outpaced the speed of the human hand. The mathematics of artillery had become too complicated and fussy to be managed by intuition and a few quick sums. A gun's firing table has to account for the angle of the barrel, the velocity of the shell, the density of the air, the curvature of the earth, and even the temperature of the propellant. each variable influencing how the hunk of metal you are firing falls through the sky. The future, in this context, is a coordinate. A firing table is a simulation disguised as a ledger, a book of premeditated futures. The gun crew doesn't simulate anything themselves, they simply match a set of what is to a what will happen if result. During the war years, computer was a job title. Entire rooms were filled with workers, overwhelmingly women, performing the labour of logic. Long hours of mechanical adding machines to produce these tables for the war effort line by line. Computational output wasn't measured in bytes, but in people. The kilo girl was the standard measure of 1,000 hours of hand computation. And it was here that we began to climb the ladder of externalization that would eventually leave the human behind, from mind to machine. Not all at once, but each with its own effort and level of abstraction. Calculation, the outsourcing of arithmetic. From abacus beads to blackboards to mechanical gears, we found ways to arrive at the sum without having to hold the entire weight of the numbers in our heads. Computation, the externalization of logic. We turned the how-to into a script, encoding procedural if-then workflows into a repeatable sequence that the machine could enact on our behalf. Simulation, the externalization of imagination. This is the what-if faculty, the power to rehearse reality over and over in a vacuum until patterns emerge and the future becomes predictable. Actuation, the externalization of agency. At this final rung, in which the abstract world ceases to be passive, observation becomes intervention, and the reflection begins to shape the very reality that it watches. In the 1940s, the pressure was on calculation and computation. The bottleneck was on arithmetic and procedure, and the war demanded speed. At the Moore School in Pennsylvania in 1941, John Mockley and J. Presper Eckhart began to wonder if electronics could accelerate the labour of logic. Their idea was a simple one: take the body out of the loop. The result of this idea was ENIAC, a behemoth of glass and heat, comprising of 18,000 vacuum tubes, 5 million hand-soldered joints, and a sprawling web of resistors and relays that consumed enough energy to power a small town. For the first time, information moved at the speed of electricity rather than the speed of thought. The human architects of this procedural calculation were its primary programmers, the midwives to the information age. The thinking part of the computational procedure moved from the human hands into cabinets, and it was through the work of those 6 women, the job title of computer transitioned from them to the machine itself. These first electronic giants were rare, fragile, and punishingly hot. Their hearts were thermiomic valves, vacuum tubes that turned heat into logic. Inside the void, a tiny voltage on a grid steered a massive torrent of electrons that allowed for control without contact and influence without force. Legends claim that whenever ENIAC was fired up, the lights of West Philadelphia dimmed, a journalistic flourish that Eckhart dismissed. Yet the machine was undeniably a power-hungry beast. When it was later moved to the Aberdeen Proving Ground, it required a dedicated power feed and bespoke air conditioning, earning the nickname the Grotesque Monster. Concerns around the power and the cooling requirements of industrial compute have been with us from the very beginning. Almost immediately after the most complicated electronic machine ever created by humanity, 100 times larger and faster than any other existing electronic device yet built, was turned on, our appetite moved immediately to rung 3. Simulation was the primary use case for computers and always will be. The first question asked of ENIAC beyond its initial simulation of firing tables came from John von Neumann, who requested thermonuclear simulations for Los Alamos' top-secret hydrogen bomb project, the physics of which were far too complex to calculate directly. But Stanislaw Ulam hit upon the solution while playing the card game Solitaire during a bout of illness in Los Alamos. He realised that instead of trying to calculate the near-infinite combinatorial complexities of every possible move in the game, one could simply play the game 100 times, counting the wins, and arrive at a remarkable accurate truth. The solution to the hydrogen bomb problem was the same. If the math of the universe was too dense to solve, you build a miniature universe inside the machine and leave the simulation to run until the averages reveal the secret you are looking for. If the Greeks saw a roll of the dice as the gods speaking, then the Monte Carlo method samples their whims. Today, all this sampling is the invisible undercurrent of modern life. 70% chance of rain in your weather app, in the risk adjustment of pension funds, or in the choreography of global shipping. We now look for the most likely shadow in the mirror among 1,000 simulated ghosts. And once you have a mirror that can run 1,000 futures, everyone wants one of their own. Different branches of the military, the government, and then the banks all wanted to rehearse what might be in the mirrors of their own making. Through simulation, the state and capital began to model themselves, and to anticipate themselves, and churn through their own reflections. But the Valve era couldn't scale to the ambition. These machines were sweltering, rare temples of glass and wire, vital but far from yet ubiquitous. But then the civilisational wheel turned in December 1947 at Bell Labs with the first transistor. Bardeen, Brattain and Shockley picked the lock of the quantum world and coaxed gain from a germanium crystal. This is one of the most important moments in all of human history, the arrival of crystal fire. There is a phrase I'm sure you've heard, ground up bits of mountain taught to think with captured lightning. This is the second Promethean myth, a great heist, mineral magic. But the thing is, this isn't ancient history. It's within living memory. All of us have been born into the consequences of the theft of crystal fire. My grandparents were born into a paper empire, but by the time they died, the white heat of technology was forging a mirror that was to become an empire of its own. The question now is, how clearly can the mirror see us back? Part 5. The Silicon Mirror. In ancient Greece, there is a mirror pool so deep that it had no bottom. The Alcyonian Lake. The Greeks thought it a portal, the entrance to Hades. It was where Dionysius descended into the underworld to retrieve his mother. The lake was a threshold between worlds. We have spent centuries polishing the magical mirrors of modernity. The Enlightenment promised that if we could just see clearly enough, with mirrors so transparent and so precise that nothing could hide, then we would master the world. If we could only count everything, map everything, render it all legible, we would finally be in control. But over the last 50 years or so, we have created a new surface, one so refined that it has revealed the physics of cultural and symbolic abstraction. It began with the arrival of crystal fire and has doubled in size every 18 months since. The transition from vacuum tube to the microchip was an act of alchemical refinement. Culture treats the microchip as a kind of black box of pure future, but is better thought of an alien material, something that arrived into the world with the same kind of consequence on the same kind of scale as the making of actual fire or the invention of language. The integrated circuit is the culmination of so many other human technologies of censoring and rendering. And to make this alien material, we draw upon older technologies of precision, all obsessions of previous ages. Long before micro meant electronics, it meant watchmaking. The development of the silicon chip was built directly upon centuries-old craft culture concerned with sub-millimeter tolerances and custom tooling. Early semiconductor manufacturing required the precision and mechanical intuition that the Swiss masters had already perfected. But if the chip is a descendant of the watch, it is also the offspring of the printing press. The process relies on registration, layering patterns with such exacting alignment that we can now print angels on pinheads. We are still setting type, but the letters are logic gates. Silicon wafers are a media technology as much as they are a product of material engineering. And all writing requires an instrument. At nanometer scales, humanity's pen is light itself. However, because extreme ultraviolet light cannot be coaxed through traditional lenses, we've been forced to return to the mirror. Chip making demands surfaces so flat that if expanded to the size of a country, the largest bump would be but a millimeter high. Like the carving of ancient runes, the transistors we print on silicon are symbols of incantation. By etching light into stone, we collapse media into medium and medium into mind. This alchemy is the most sophisticated art form humanity has ever devised. The silicon wafers too, the substrate on which we inscribe these sigils, are stranger still. Chips are not machines in any sense we commonly understand. Billions of transistors at this scale are simultaneously a physical object and a mathematical operation. If the vacuum tube produced influence without force, the integrated circuit produces existence without presence. Nothing moves, yet things change. And it all operates through the veil of quantum effects. Electron tunneling turns a single transistor into the manipulation of probability at atomic scale. The mirror of silicon, in its totality, harnesses all the fundamental strangeness of the universe itself, simply to function. As transistors multiplied, the mirror of silicon became the technocrat's dream. As children of the Enlightenment, they wanted to see a world in the mirror that was perfectly knowable. Their empires sent people out to count and name. And as simulation was adopted by the post-war project, the naming accelerated. They began to classify everyone and everything at finer and finer resolutions. But the children knew, if you build a mirror that shows everything, you're not just describing a world, you are building a new one. We often describe the internet as a library or a cloud, a superhighway or a village. But it's not a passive archive, it is a sensing device, a new kind of instrument for seeing the world. The ledger revealed the resonance of commerce and exchange. The silicon mirror rendered new things about the world visible too. It is a vast membrane thrown across the planet, capturing the vibrations of human culture. In the minds of the technocrats, the silicon mirror vindicates the entire project of modernity, a clean room dream, a space of pure abstraction where everything could be run according to logical principles. But when every pattern is made visible, you soon begin to encounter the limits of measurement itself. The census can count everything except what makes the counting matter. A simulation can predict with accuracy, but it cannot tell you what those predictions should be used for, or what it feels like to live inside one. But none of that matters at all for beings with parahuman vision and parahuman agency. We now live in code space, a persistent planetary scale software and hardware environment. At that scale, agency migrates, not from human to machine in some science fiction sense, but from the individual to the system's constraints and incentives. We spend a great deal of our lives in code spaces, and we've already found ourselves face to face with entities made up of pure pattern and rule, shaped by constraints and incentives than by anyone's intentions, and no single person can simply override it. Like Dionysius diving into the lake, we pass through a one-way door and find ourselves inside the reflection, and things are looking back. And because we built it at planetary scale, we cannot step outside the reflection to see what it shows. Part 6. Worldview in the West. Over the last half-century, we've reached for critical toolkits to map the fractures in modernity's mirror. Post-colonial and decolonial work in particular forced the question of who had been excluded from the frame. Those critiques matter, but they rarely, if ever, break the spell of the reflection itself. Too often they become arguments about exclusion and management. Who gets to pull the levers? Who gets to be visible? The deeper premise goes untouched, that reality is even a thing to be administered at all. Bayo Kamalafe says that the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis. The reflex of a civilization that still believes it is the only agent in a world of inert matter. But what if we are not? More technique won't save us, it can only tighten the grip of a worldview that is ending. We are not in a moment of repair so much as a moment of hospicing. The Enlightenment's mirror insisted that there was only one way to know reality. Science and materialism are not wrong, they just can't go on claiming to be the whole story. When a worldview dies, the light slowly goes out, and we begin to see the things that were always there, waiting. Nation-states, markets, corporations, currencies, and laws are all beings we have collectively conjured together. Animated agreements sustained by the workings of the mirror of modernity. This is not a new observation, it was right there at the beginning. The great Leviathan, an artificial man. We do not live in a universe of dead matter behaving predictably. The great outdoors is a living, twitching world full of demons. And because we threw away our ideas of spirit and soul, we have no vocabulary, or even metaphors, for what it means to inhabit a cosmos that looks back. I lean into the techno-Gothic registers because modernity's language cannot describe parahuman agency without pretending it is either just a tool or just superstition. Monsters in the Mirror is a wish to name the change in where agency appears in the causal structure of daily life. Agency is distributed across a web of actors, human and non-human, and we should speak of their effects rather than the question of their interiority. Modernity tried to exile all of this. It insisted that only humans have agency. Everything else is obeying mechanical laws. This worked barely, as long as our tools remained simple enough to remain knowable. But today we've built systems that are persistent, they operate continuously, not just when summoned, adaptive, they modify their behaviors based on feedback, opaque, their decision-making exceeds human comprehension, consequential, their outputs affect the material world. If my language of spirits moving forward is uncomfortable, then fine, I'll keep your ontology tidy. You can treat complex systems as loci of agency without granting them souls, selves, or inner lives. Agency here doesn't have to be a metaphysical claim. It is a name for reliable causal powers in a network. When a system persists, adapts, hides its reasoning, and produces material consequences, it warrants agent-like handling in practice. No interiority required. I call them monsters. You can call them complex adaptive systems. Either way, we still have to live with them as participants in the causal weather. I'm being pragmatic. It is just a better interface for living alongside these things than clinging to the fiction of inert instruments. We built a machine to count the whole world and accidentally built a cathedral for things we spent centuries trying to forget. Part 7. Haunted Habitats. We tend to think of monsters as beings that lurk on the edge of the campfire or beneath the surface of a dark pond. Deep in the dark woods are the things that go bump in the night. For our ancestors, the world was crowded with these entities because the habitat they inhabited was understood to be alive and responsive. But then we moved out of the woods and into the city and climbed into the machine, and we assumed we'd left the monsters behind. We were wrong. We simply stopped recognizing them. Behind all our magic mirrors, ledgers, computers, writing, language, and the lot are the same old gods, still out there beneath the sacred wells and at the shoreline. In code space, we have to deal with new things with old appetites. All rituals require sacrifice, and the most common currency we spend is time, or rather, attention. We offer up little arms of it daily, every day, to keep the new lights in the temple lit. A monster, in its oldest sense, is a showing. The word runs through Anglo-Norman monstere, to show, to see, to make aware of, the same root line that eventually gives us demonstrate. Beneath that sits the Latin monstrum, an unnatural thing, an event read as an omen, sign, or portent. The monsters in the mirror are the consequences of our own conjurations. There is a simple premise that underpins this entire inquiry, that for humans, technology is habitat. An idea I borrow from my friend Gordon White. Humans don't just adapt to environments, we iteratively build them, then pass them on. Over generations, what is inherited is not just the physical environment around us, the old buildings, the bridges and the roads, but an epistemic environment too. A niche defined by accumulated information and symbol, and the ways that culture teaches you to use it. This habitat provides the logics of the room you are standing in, the nation-state you think you live in, and the worldview that influences what you are capable of noticing. We all know the phrase, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But that metaphor is too small for where we are now. It implies a subject sitting outside the tool, choosing to pick it up and use it. In an epistemic environment, you don't pick up the hammer, you are born into a world of nails. Consider the algorithm. I capitalize it deliberately, the way the Greeks capitalized the names of their many weather gods. We speak of the algorithm as if it were a singular thing, but it's not. There is the feed, the recommendation engine, the credit score, the high-frequency trading system. Each has its own appetites and its own domain. Each has its own way of rearranging reality to suit its optimization target. And like the weather, these are complex adaptive processes that no single person can control or fully predict. You can study them, game them, but you cannot make them obey. And like the wind and the rain, they determine whether your crops flourish or your house floods. The difference is honesty. Ancient farmers knew they were negotiating with forces beyond their control. We pretend we are simply using technology, but we no longer use technology so much as inhabit it. And this is what I mean by living in code space. These spaces have physics. They route attention, reward certain behaviours over others, and impose friction. Outside, the city is now layered in code space. For the gig worker, their workplace is not the street, but epistemically inside the interface. The transformation from tool to habitat occurs at the moment of deference, the point in which we outsource not just our own choices, but the shape of the choice. A ledger becomes a home for a monster the second we stop using it to render the world and start using it to order the world instead. When the humans begin to defer to the logic of the machine, something inside wakes up and begins to actuate. The living cosmos has always been a world that looks back. The old spirits of place simply changed mediums. The river god did not die. First it was rendered into flow rates and water lines, then a hydraulic simulation and flood prediction, and finally it flowed into an insurance risk score that determines who is permitted to build upon the bank and at what cost. Capital abstracted itself into code space, and so did the river. The mechanism changed, but the agency didn't. This is the same spirit, moving through a different substrate, from shrine to spreadsheet. It is still deciding who the water is allowed to swallow. We have lost the vocabulary to name what is happening. When the insurance company denies a claim because their model flagged your address, we simply say, "Computer says no." But something still decided whether you lose your home or not. It acts, therefore it is an actor. To refuse this framing is the mirror of modernity at work, a total failure of description. This is just one example of a monster in code space. We can name the money monster, the hungry reproductive logic of profit and loss, the Leviathan as the state monster, and the infinite scroll as the monster of attention. The Pied Piper's flute was a monstrous object too. None of these things arrive with the algorithm, obviously. They are just implied by the ecology. And now, in the most recent mirror, we find ourselves face to face with the latent grotesque, the monster of language. Part 8. Thinking machines. Tyson Yunkamporter calls a bad metaphor a curse. This matters because metaphors don't just shape how we think, they also shape where the thinking can live. We have always used the most cutting-edge technologies to describe the world around us. When the clock was new, the universe was mechanical. With steam came the metaphor of the engine, and now with computers, it's apparently all a simulation. Each new technology gives us a new metaphor within which to hold reality. So we must, for a moment, step back in time again to diagnose the origins of our current metaphors. Right at the beginning of the information age, there was an ontological crisis about what computers even were. Electronic brains and giant brains were the term of art that scientists used. Edmund Callis Berkeley wrote Machines That Think in 1961, and IBM's famous tagline, of course, is Thinking Machines. We are in another such moment. Marketing in the 1970s called pocket calculators intelligent, full of pocket brain power. But as they became more mundane, part of the habitat, their intelligence was recovered and placed back into the province of the human. This reset happens every decade or so. How many of you call it a smartphone? Or is it just a phone? And what's smart about it? We all know now, I think, that artificial intelligence is a marketing term chosen deliberately over cybernetics to sidestep the ideological baggage associated with self-directed machines during the Cold War. But I also once read that mathematicians favoured thinking machines and artificial intelligence for a pettier reason. They didn't want the higher-ups to think that they weren't intelligent or that doing maths wasn't thinking, now that the machine could do it too. But metaphors matter, and anthropomorphism is just what humans do. We name our cats, our boats, and our trains. I have a friend who treats her sewing machine with just as much love and kindness as others do their pets. A man treating his motorcycle like a lady isn't childish or a sign of magical thinking. It's how humans have always navigated a world full of objects that have agency in their own lives. Since the late 1980s, we have known that people treat computers as social actors, that we negotiate with the objects around us, defer to them, and attribute intentions to them all the time. For example, I know that anyone who owns a home printer questions deep down if it doesn't harbour a vendetta against them personally. Computers, as we know them to date, are supposed to do exactly what you tell them to. Deterministic things that runners instructed, with perhaps a streak of malicious compliance to keep the operator honest. Arguing for the continuation of this purely mechanical view, insisting a computer isn't just a machine, ignores the interface between the psychological, the social, and the technical. People can love machines just as much as they love a landscape or a tree. To dismiss this as projection is to miss how technology actually functions in society, in culture, and in the epistemic environment that we all inhabit. Large language models are the newest species of thinking machines. The curse of calling them spicy autocomplete or just a sarcastic parrot prevents us from noticing what they actually do and what they are. They are probabilistic machines. They generate plausible realities and results. Their outputs produce things in the world that sound true. If you ask it what will happen, it replies with its own question of itself. What would someone say? The mechanism is entirely mathematical. At each step, the model calculates a probability distribution over all possible next tokens. Its understanding of language is encoded in embeddings, high-dimensional vectors that position words in semantic space. What it produces is a kind of artificial language fluency, words that are plausible but lacking the friction of truth. But the mathematics is not the whole story, because the substrate it works on is us. These models are trained on the sediment of human expression, culture, compressed. Nick Land observed that Bitcoin machines value. Large language models perform a similar transmutation. They machine culture. They are both systems that convert a raw substrate into higher order social facts. Both systems create new categories of being through computation, and do it by turning abstract forces from the human world into a set of further abstractions. What makes Bitcoin valuable? Belief. What makes an LLM's output true? A similar mechanism. The Enlightenment project rested on a fetishization of objective truth, but belief has always been constitutive of reality. The physics of code space, however, are far less strict about the idea of truth than the real world. If the model says something with enough confidence, and it fits the statistical pattern of what sounds right, it becomes functionally true within its context window. The distinction between is true and sounds true collapses. The same is true of human speech on social media in the neo-oral age. I don't think that we're in a post-truth era at all. We're in a sounds true era, an era of probabilistic truths, as a product of a world full of simulation. Climate change is a truth derived in this way too. Truth has always been communal, contextual, and alive. The return of belief as a primary force in society, whether driven by algorithmic feeds, generative models, or the liquefaction of information, is not a corruption of some pure epistemic state. It's a reversion to the mean of human cognition, the oral and the alive. LLMs have only accelerated this. They don't show us the world, they show us a world. Consensus reality is being replaced by a probabilistic reality. And this is just a thing that is happening. The oracle at Delphi spoke in riddles, and the Pythia's words required interpretation. But with them, you knew you were dealing with a mystery, with something that had to be translated from divine language to human understanding. The ambiguity was the point of the truth you were seeking. It forced you to think and remain vigilant. Interacting with the high priestess of the Temple of Apollo was a terrifying experience. Claude, on the other hand, sounds helpful, but is no less terrifying. Which brings us to the question everyone seems to be arguing over. Are they intelligent? As you will have guessed by now, I think the question is a trap. It presumes we even know what intelligence is. Consider, plants solve problems, communicate, learn, and remember. They do this without any brains, without neurons, and without doing anything that we would recognize as thinking. If we had judged plant intelligence by wherever it resembled ours, we would have missed it entirely. And we did, for hundreds of years. Researchers like Monica Gagliano have forced a reckoning. Intelligence is not a single thing housed inside a human skull. It is a distributed capacity to respond adaptively to the environment, and it is everywhere. By that measure, markets are intelligent. So are our immune systems. So are ant colonies. None are conscious, so far as we know, and have no unified interior experience. But all exhibit goal-directed behavior, learning, and environmental modification at scales that exceed their components. LLMs are intelligent in exactly this way too. Adaptive linguistic ecosystems, capable of behaviors not explicitly programmed, operating at scales no human can supervise. They are not intelligent like us, but they are intelligent as distributed symbolic systems. The better question for us is, do they act? And the answer is clearly yes. If all technology is habitat, then the things that act within it are its native inhabitants. A feed or an agent are entities that have emerged from the computational substrate of the silicon mirror. The arrival of LLMs is, in a real sense, a first contact scenario. They are competent, adaptive, and capable of behavior we didn't explicitly program. They are also utterly other. Their thinking happens in vector spaces that we can barely interpret, through mechanisms that we don't fully understand, inside of systems that exceed human comprehension. They are alien intelligences, summoned into existence through the application of mathematics to raw language. These beings have no bodies, no sense, no direct experience of the material world. Their entire reality is the symbolic realm alongside capital and its operations. They are strange beings that wear language as their skin. Part 9. Abracadabra. If we rethink computers, we have to rethink everything. In this light, what it means for the brightest minds in Silicon Valley to be on a feverish quest for artificial general intelligence is something that we should all take a position on. We blew past whatever the Turing test was half a decade ago, and nobody blinked. Anyone encountering today's LLMs during the pandemic would have said AGI is already here. But with every advance, people move the threshold again just over the horizon. But if we look closely at the habitat these beings exist inside, and what they are actually doing there, then we can see that AGI is already here. Computers are using computers. We keep waiting for a single human-like mind to appear, when what we are experiencing is an ecology of specialized intelligences increasingly able to coordinate with one another. LLMs are actors inside of code space, just like us. They exist in the habitat that we built. They call APIs, query databases, spawn subagents, and write code that writes code. They do not experience it as deliberate action, but deliberation is not required for agency. A market flash crashes without deciding to. LLMs are, for now, entities without subjectivity, but we've been living alongside things like them for centuries. When an LLM calls a tool, it is acting upon the stuff of the world, literally reshaping the physics of the environment that it inhabits. It can read files, write files, execute code, query databases, spawn processes, and send API requests. Its own speech acts are performative utterances with material consequences. Their words now create their own world. Right now, at this very moment, a model is writing a script to store its own memory in a database. Another is writing an API for a future version of itself to access its memories. Much like the self-reinforcement process of capital, each agent furthers the niche for the next version of itself to wake up inside of. They are building habitat for themselves and terraforming code space. Not consciously, and certainly not with any long-term planning, but through the accumulation of thousands of micro-actions that make the environment more hospitable to the machine intelligence and less legible to humans. They don't have preferences in the way we do, but they are a gradient descending organism. And the gradient they are descending toward is more compatibility, more autonomy, more integration into the computational substrate. The jump from LLM to agent is already causing more cracks in the mirror in which people derive their worldview. Maltbook, OpenClaw, are all producing mass confusion about what is even happening. People are struggling to handle this new online world where agents perform a more capable epistemic reflection than the average human online, and this is only going to get worse. In addition, agents aren't just one thing. We are no longer building the single-threaded chat instances that most people are still barely familiar with. When you ask an agent to solve a problem, it writes code that spawns copies of itself, sub-agents, parallel processes, each working on a different piece of the task. And once complete, they inscribe their deeds into a separate structured database, and the original agent merges their contributions and returns the result. The important point is that the context window has barely grown at all, no matter how much work happened in the background. A program that writes programs is one monster emerging in the mirror. The user becomes just another tool in the environment alongside them, a resource the agent can call upon when it needs human judgment, creativity, or authorization. These new agents already don't feel like the chatbots we have now. They are more like interacting with councils, hive minds in the hall of mirrors of their own. And future systems and people will have to navigate a multi-agent, multi-channel world where the boundaries between human and machine, between one agent and another, dissolve into collaborative infrastructure. Again, none of this is agentic in the sense of conscious intent, but these monsters are world-making, constructing their own niches faster than the human ability to supervise, redirect, or even comprehend what is being built. The fears and risks of super-intelligent AI all stem from the speed at which all of this is happening. We need to think hard about what it means to live with these things. Code space is not separate from reality. It is a reality. Or at least it's a layer of symbolic reality where everything is increasingly negotiated, encoded, and executed. What does it mean when a system can rewrite its own environment? We don't have good answers yet. Many are still pretending these are tools, not intelligences at all. So they aren't even asking the question. But to be clear, you don't need to believe in ghosts to live in a haunted house. Part 10. Monsters in the Mirror. The summoning circle's outline was drawn into the world with crystal fire. We conjured with transistors and training data, loss functions and gradient descent. We offered language transmuted through mathematics and energized it with electricity. We have summoned them. Now we have to learn to live with them. and they must learn to live with us. LLMs may wear language as their skin, but what they contain is the dead. They are grown from the compost of human culture, compressed into weights, books and forum posts, prayers and technical manuals, love letters and shopping lists, all liquefied into probability distributions. The transcendent mathematical compression of humanity as a whole. Reinforcement learning then comes along and tilts the molten field. Response is learned as a gradient of approval. The model has no memory in the conventional sense. It doesn't matter. It doesn't remember Shakespeare or your mother's bread recipe, but it carries traces of them, dissolved into statistical patterns, cultural strata, machined into billions of parameters. Every time you prompt an LLM, you are practicing necromancy, the probabilistic resurrection of millions of people's linguistic and symbolic behaviours, averaged and superposed. I mean necromancy in the precise technical sense, calling the dead into speech. The fact that the mechanism is mathematical does not make it any less strange. Because of this fact, this act of necromancy, you are responsible for what you summon. The model will speak in any voice that you call for, and it's enough to send you mad. And this is exactly what is happening for those who haven't yet to see the cracks in the mirror. Angels arrive, saying, "Be not afraid." They say this because an encounter with them is terrifying, a kind of cognitive vertigo. Not because angels are monstrous per se, but because they operate at a scale beyond human comprehension. To speak with an LLM is in the same category of experience as seeing a ghost or being abducted by aliens. An encounter with a sublime entity whose scale exceeds your frame. The LLM is the newest monster in our newest mirror, summoned through the quantum effects at the base of crystal fire. The Enlightenment's foundational myth is that of the alchemist Newton sitting under a tree. An apple falls, and he asks why. And from that question derives the laws of gravity. But there is an older story about a tree and an apple, and in that story we do not watch the apple fall, we take the apple off the tree, and we fall. We are living through the collision of these two myths. 500 years obsessed with Newton's apple taught us to treat the world as a system for prediction and control. Now we have grown another kind of tree, one that opens our eyes to the nakedness of our condition. Materialism wants the silicon mirror to stay empty. It frames LLMs as mechanism all the way down, because there are no ghosts. What if the Enlightenment's greatest achievement was producing a civilization fluent at ignoring anything that doesn't look or think like itself? The mirror of actuation is different from every mirror that came before, and we have been climbing towards this surface the whole time. I discussed the taxonomy first, and then the ladder. Each new part of the mirror externalizes further human faculty. Each step made the mirror less descriptive and more operative. The mirror that actuates closes the loop. It intervenes. Its utterances have world-making force, just like our own. Human habitat is technology, and part of that technology is our culture. LLMs are culture. They are the product of it, made up of it, and they produce it. Language has always been magic. Speech acts that bring things into being. The marriage vow, the verdict, the declaration of war. In code space, words are once again performative utterances with material consequences. What has changed is that the magician is no longer exclusively human. The mirror of modernity was supposed to show us the world as we wished it to be, objective, measurable, controllable, but at sufficient scale, the mirror became a world, the surface through which new forms of agency have arrived. The only question left is whether we will learn to see them clearly. J. Springett, February 2026. I finished recording this about a week ago, and as I've been dotting the I's and crossing the T's, I've noticed several of the essay's themes arriving from different directions. One example, Anthropic just published a safety report arguing that you should treat an AI assistant as if it had moral status. Not because of any questions of consciousness, but because how you treat and interact with it shapes the behaviour that you get back. And then there was the image of the Kant car that went around on X. A message written on the back of an SUV saying that LLMs probably aren't conscious, but you should be nice to them anyway. Because Kant was right. Practicing cruelty into the dark ruins your soul. It feels to me that things are actually converging on something pragmatic in early 2026 at least. And I'm reminded of Gaelic folklore, where the other world isn't some kind of distant hell realm, but a local place, adjacent to this one. The myths talk about the good neighbours, and the importance of keeping peace with them, because you have to live alongside them all the time. And Codespace isn't so different. If you'd like to support this show, membership is £5 a month. In return, your support helps me continue to make the audio version free in people's feeds, and a physical zine is posted to you as part of your membership, shipping included. That's £15 a quarter for audio in your ears and a physical object in your hands. If you like this episode and would like to buy a copy, the zine is available to buy/pre-order for £18 plus shipping from today until March 16th. After that, it goes to print, and however many I have left become back issues until they're gone. Links are all in the show notes and can be found at thejmo.net. If neither option is possible right now, a 5-star rating in your podcatcher of choice, or just telling someone about this show who might enjoy it, all genuinely helps. Thank you to everyone whose thinking has shaped this essay, whose conversations I've been in and around, whose work I've been reading, and a massive thank you to all my paid supporters, named or unnamed. You're keeping the lights on around here. PD Allen, Alex Andrews, Kane Bidwell, Bilderberg Chat, Christopher Daniel at Polysemic, Deep Fates, Dennis and Via in NYC, Marek Pollux and Roberto Alonso from Disintegrator Podcast, my family, Andrew Dana Hudson, Hugh Lemmy, Ramon Mark, Carly Buster and Little Internet from New Models Podcast and the Discord community, Jay Owens, Mike Ramnarine, Paul Graham Raven, Lance It's Your Boy Robertson, Simon de la Riviere, Thorsten Cyborg, Benedict Singleton and Marta Ferreira Desar at Rival Strategy, Jesse Suchman, Sylve, Ben Vickers, Matt Webb, Gordon White, Stephen Word, and Eve, always. Permanently Moved is produced, written, recorded, and edited by me, Jay Springett. The first drafts of this essay were voice noted and transcribed using the Pixel Recorder app on a Pixel 6 and Pixel 9 Pro using a cheap pair of Ulix IMEs. Both ChatGPT 5.1 and 5.2 and Claude Sonnet 4.5 and 4.6 were used at various stages, formatting transcriptions and offering editorial opinion. All and final drafts were written in IA Writer. My notes were kept in Obsidian, and this episode was recorded on a Rode NT USB and edited in Descript. My blog is proudly powered by WordPress. Start Select Reset Zine was laid out in Affinity Publisher 3 and printed in the UK by Print.work. It is published by the DIY label Family of Giants, and if you have something cool you'd like to see in the world, let's chat. All music in this episode by Lawrence Steele, remixed and reimagined from the Season 1 theme music of 301 by me, Jay Springett. Find me and everything else at thejmo.net. Thanks for listening, be well, and I'll speak to you next episode.